Well, I'm really excited to be here. Whenever I present on this topic, I like to start with a little bit of a thought reflection. So no need to publicly self-disclose, but I'm curious if you've had any of the following thoughts at work or in school. I think other people think I have more knowledge or ability than I think I do. People important to me see me as more capable than I see myself. I've received greater recognition from others than I merit. I'm not as qualified as others think I am. Maybe you had these thoughts when you joined an organization, maybe they occurred when you took on a new role, or maybe it's actually when you took on additional responsibilities at work, such as leading a team or leading a department. If you've had any of these thoughts, they're likely not ones that you've said aloud. They're likely ones that are whispered in the hushed corners of your office, in the quiet depths of your soul. Importantly, however, research suggests that you're not alone. In fact, 7 out of 10 working adults have claimed to have entertained these thoughts at least at one point in their careers. Research in management psychology traces these thoughts to what is popularly known as the imposter syndrome, or the imposter phenomenon, which tends to categorize people as imposters or not. And if you're an imposter, it's generally bad news. It's been associated with things like decreased psychological well-being and decreased self-esteem in psychology, and the work in management isn't much more promising, associating it with decreased job attitudes like job satisfaction and commitment. As a result, the prevailing wisdom is that experiencing this phenomenon is uniformly harmful no matter the work outcome of interest. Indeed, one can observe a cottage industry of self-help books and management tomes and articles that all warn of the dangers of feeling like an imposter at work. So, case closed, right? Well, today I'm going to argue maybe not so much. And to do this, I'm going to take us on a journey back to 9 years ago when I was a PhD student at Wharton. I was sitting there and fretting over what was going to be my big PhD dissertation idea. And so I did what I thought academics do to come up with their good ideas. I brewed some tea. I checked out a couple dusty old books from the library, put that on my desk for, the view. And I also had a trusty armchair. And I was like, great, I have all the ingredients to come up with a good idea. About 20 minutes into this exercise, I actually found myself quite distracted. I was reading a little bit of New York Times, a little Reddit, and then I found myself on Cosmopolitan. And I started reading this article, Are You Suffering from Imposter Syndrome? And I was sitting there and I was like, oh, this seems pretty interesting. I've heard of this phenomenon before. But I couldn't help but reflect that it seemed really unscientific. Where was the research behind this phenomenon? What were academics actually saying? So I turned to the original paper on this phenomenon, which was written by Clance and Imes in the late 1970s, and I started to read through it, and I was struck by this fact that they kept repeating that this phenomenon was not inherently self-damaging or destructive. Moreover, when I reflected more broadly about who really talks about having this phenomenon, I realized it was actually a lot of really successful people. People like Albert Einstein, Maya Angelou, Michelle Obama, Sheryl Sandberg. And so it occurred to me, what if these people were succeeding because of their imposter thoughts, not in spite of them? And so, eureka, I had my idea. I started to chase it down. First, I went into a finance organization, and I did a very simple 2-time-point study. At time 1, I asked employees to provide their ratings of their imposter thoughts, and at time 2, I asked their supervisors to provide performance and interpersonal effectiveness ratings. I crunched the data, looked at my screen, and got super excited. I found that those finance employees who reported more frequent imposter thoughts were also those employees who were rated as more interpersonally effective by their supervisors. I was excited, but like a good academic, I was like, wait a second. Maybe there's something strange about this finance firm. Maybe this is a fluke. So I went to a completely different context. I went to the medical context, and I started studying physicians in training. And these physicians in training were interacting with standardized patients, who are essentially people in the local area, often actors, who partner with medical schools to pretend like they have particular illnesses or symptoms to further physician education. A week before these interactions, I asked these physicians in training to provide ratings of their imposter thoughts. After the interaction, standardized patients indicated how interpersonally effective they found these physicians. I got the data, and again, started crunching the numbers, and again found the same relationship. Those physicians in training who had more frequent imposter thoughts, that is, they thought others overestimated their abilities, were rated by the standardized patients as more interpersonally effective once again. And so far I've been telling you guys this great story about, okay, if you have imposter thoughts, it's only gonna lead to benefits. You're gonna find yourself as more interpersonally effective. But obviously, if these physicians with more frequent imposter thoughts were making bad diagnoses, or these finance professionals with more imposter thoughts were making bad investment decisions, this interpersonal upside won't be that great. But I had the data here again, and I did not actually find across the board that those with more frequent imposter thoughts were performing worse than their peers with less frequent imposter thoughts. I also replicated these effects in the lab to make sure that this was causal. And again, I found that essentially imposter thoughts was causing you to adopt an other-focused orientation, which I also observed among these physicians. They sort of nodded their head a lot more, they made more eye contact. And as a result of these verbal, nonverbal, and paraverbal indicators, others were finding them to be more interpersonally effective. So what does this mean for you? So what I don't want you to take away from this presentation is that you should make sure you always have imposter thoughts if you want to be interpersonally effective, or that you should induce imposter thoughts in others if you want to make sure you have interpersonally effective colleagues. There are actually a lot better ways to make your colleagues more interpersonally effective that don't have a psychological toll. Indeed, across my studies, I actually found that the reason you become more other-focused as a result of having imposter thoughts is actually kicked off by a drop in self-esteem. So rather, what I want you guys to think about is the power that we have in reframing our imposter thoughts when we have them. They're likely to strike precisely at those times in which you are in a stretch experience or experiencing a challenge. So in those moments, it's important to remind yourself that although they might not feel that great, they actually may be the reason that you are soaring to new heights, particularly interpersonally. And remember that they're thoughts. There's a reason I keep using the phrase imposter thoughts. They're thoughts, they come and go. Now, before I end, I also want to address an elephant in the room. So whenever people talk about the imposter phenomenon, or what I call imposter thoughts, they often talk about gender and race. And you've probably noticed I haven't talked at all about gender and race today. And part of that reason is I actually haven't found gender or racial effects across my studies. And indeed, this actually aligns with recent systematic reviews of the literature. And so just like we might be subscribing to this overwhelmingly negative view of the imposter phenomenon, we might also be mistakenly attributing this phenomenon to those of a particular gender or those of a particular race. And doing so might actually be really messing up our understanding of the phenomenon and potentially conflating it with other things that we care about, like belonging and fear. And so there's a lot to unpack here still. There's a lot of myths to continue to bust. And it's over the next couple of years that I look forward to continuing to engage in this myth busting. So on that note, I want to leave you with one final thought that I hope summarizes everything, which is the next time that you feel that you're experiencing these thoughts and you're feeling intrapersonally uncomfortable, remember that this might be the reason that others find you interpersonally comfortable. Thank you.
Thank you, Basima. So we have one question, maybe a follow-up too. So how can organizations create a supportive environment that helps individuals overcome imposter syndrome, but I like your framing, thoughts, and achieve their full potential? And then you mentioned this word reframing. Maybe you could follow up with that. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to sort of reframe the question a little bit as well, which is, so I've told you all that there can be this interpersonal upside. So if I'm leading an organization, I want to be thinking about how can I make sure that interpersonal upside comes out. So if we think back to the pandemic and imagine you're a coder, if you're a coder and you're not interacting with anybody and you're having imposter thoughts, there's actually going to be a net negative here. Right? There isn't an opportunity to see this interpersonal upside. You're having this psychological toll that is being kicked off by self-esteem decrease, and performance-wise, you're maybe not, doing better or worse. And so what this sort of indicates to me is if we know that our employees are going to be in these stretch experiences, we need to create opportunities for them to experience this interpersonal upside. We need to make sure that we're checking in with our employees. And from a psychological well-being standpoint, we need to recognize that this still carries a mental toll, right? So we need to make sure that we're engaging and providing resources that are supporting the psychological well-being of our employees. That's a great question.
And maybe a follow-up would be, I was thinking about the question of curiosity. So curiosity is something around, you're maybe curious about ideas, and then I was hearing the word empathy. There's something about how you're framing imposter thoughts as there's something that makes us more empathetic to people around us. So curiosity is sometimes say, I got to be more curious, but there's something here around, I got to be more curious, empathetic about, even when but I'm at this heightened state. That's a really delicate balance.
And I think this is a great question too for a couple other reasons as well, which is this idea of being other-oriented. I will tell you guys that across my studies, it was actually subconscious. If I really asked people, were you on purpose trying to sort of pay more attention to others in your environment, I didn't actually find that to be the case. So it's sort of almost this subconscious thing that imposter thoughts is making us more curious about others, but it's not necessarily a message that we're telling ourselves consciously to engage in.
And maybe, I'm very curious about this.
Just like, keep going.
Yeah, keep going. Is this question of how do you, what would make people less likely to have that type of curiosity, empathy, interpersonal? Do you notice any patterns That's
a great question.
Maybe that's a future research question.
Yeah, it is a future research question. I'll have to reflect on it in the moment. I mean, what we do know from psychology is that the higher you are in power, the less likely you are to pay attention to others. So it's possible that actually at the higher end of the organizational hierarchy, you're not going to see this other-oriented behavior as much, depending on where you sit in the organizational hierarchy, but that's an open question. What is really interesting about sort of this work and what keeps me excited and up at night is that I continue to find that people are sort of being more other-oriented, regardless of whether they're choosing to or opting to or desiring to.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all.